Okay. Alright, so we looked at the interaction of sensation and perception. So now we're going to look a little more closely at this idea of perception. Right? So we believed that movement is important to the development of perception. So we talked a little bit about depth perception in the previous chapter. So what we think perhaps is that moving, self-locomotion, is necessary to couple together perception and purposeful movement. Alright, so remember that perception is the processes that are going on in the brain, selecting information, organizing that information, integrating it together. Right? So if I want to link perception with deliberate moving, that moving, being able to self-locomote seems to be very important. It's difficult to study this idea, okay? Because in order to study it, we would have to have two populations, one of whom we didn't allow to move. And then we could test the difference in their perceptual development. And obviously that's not ethically or morally acceptable, with humans at least. I'll show you some research with animals where they have a little less problem. All right. So now that we've got very sophisticated brain imaging techniques like MRIs and PET scans, we're able to, right now there's a big boom in this area of research because we're able to actually look at what the brain is doing while the individual is moving or thinking even about moving. Right? So I don't want you to spend too much time on the historical ideas. Just look at them briefly. We talked about information processing. Information processing was predominant from the 70s up until really the mid-90s. Right. The most important idea here is this last point here, that in the past it was believed that if we gave children perceptual motor programs, so motor programs, motor skill work that was specifically geared to perception, that they would improve. So let's say they were delayed in the classroom for one reason or another, that giving them these motor programs would improve their skill in the classroom, their academic skill. And that really did not hold true when we started testing it more carefully. All right? The way that they evaluated the perceptual motor programs had some flaws in it, and it gave them kind of skewed data that suggested that these programs would work. But when the research was run with more efficient, more scientifically based methodologies, those findings were not supported. All right? So, as I said, don't spend too much time on the historical information in the chapter, because there's a lot of technical perceptual stuff coming. Right? So the contemporary view really is that we believe that doing motor activities that link perception and motor together closely is very important. We wouldn't claim now that it would improve learning disabilities anymore. All right? So doing activities that work on eye-hand coordination, that work on laterality, that work on balance are very important for children and adults, that they will give kids experience at performing these skills that need a lot of perceptual information to perform them successfully. Right? It helps us reinforce concepts like directions and shapes. Okay, so on the playground, some of you, the playground's been a little bit hit and miss so far this semester with the weather, but you've seen, some of you have seen the foam shapes. We've got triangles, we've got squares. All right, we put different shapes down on the floor for them to jump onto, things like that. And also doing these kinds of motor activities seem to promote positive self-esteem and outlook and give the children more confidence in their movement skills. All right? So we can design lesson plans that target particular aspects of perception if we want to. So, you know, that is an option. If you've got like Matteo, probably because of his size, although he's quite strong, is struggling with his balance right now. Right? So when we're doing the warm-up, he really, really struggles with any of the balance activities in the warm-up. So I want to try to encourage him over the rest of the semester to really play with the balance toys. He tends to avoid the balance toys. Right? I don't think he went anywhere near the balance toys today. So, you know, he knows somewhere inside his little brain, he knows he's not very good at balancing. Right? So for years we studied motor and cognitive development separately as two separate entities. The early childhood researchers, Piaget and a couple of the others, really began the work of pulling the two together and looking at how movement affects cognitive development and vice versa. Right? Areas of the brain, so using this imaging, these imaging techniques now, we've worked out that areas of the brain that are involved in making and carrying out plans also interact with areas that control movement decisions. So in 2008, it was hypothesized that physical activity triggers brain activity that facilitates acute learning, cognitive learning. Acute, not chronic, all right? So what that suggests is that if we organize our schedules at school so that the children get regular movement activity around lumps, units of cognitive learning, that they will do better on those cognitive learning units because of the physical activity. Now, there's been quite a lot of research, and I have to say I have not stayed up with it, but I know that there's been quite a lot of interest looking at, is it better for them to have physical activity first and then do the cognitive unit, because the physical activity brings them into the cognitive unit more alert and more relaxed, and they're able to sit still and be attentive to the cognitive unit, or, of course I'm biased, I would say just do both, or do I do the cognitive unit and then do physical activity, and does that physical activity allow the brain to incorporate that cognitive learning that came beforehand more strongly, right? As I say, I don't know why you just wouldn't do both. The more physical activity they get, it doesn't have to be a lot, right? It really, 10 minutes has been shown to make a big difference. Last year, one of the early childhood students that was working at the CDC ran a little study, and when the children came in off PE with us, she gave them a little game to play, and what she found was that they were way more successful, way more attentive on the game than they were when they did it on days when they didn't do PE with us, right? So even at preschool, taking them out and playing and letting them be physically active is shown to impact what they're able to do in the classroom and learn. Right? So the cerebellum, an area in the brain, plays a key role. So it's back here. All the motor information that the motor cortex sends out passes through the cerebellum. The cerebellum is responsible for tweaking the motor output, and it aids with coordination and timing and things like that. So it's important in posture and coordination of complex skills, but that area of the brain is also linked to the hypothalamus and memory. All right? Also to areas that are responsible for emotion, areas that are responsible for language. So we've got this interaction occurring in the brain between the area that is responsible for movement and the areas that are responsible for all these other skill sets. Okay? So when we exercise, we increase proteins in the brain that are responsible for growing new synapses, new connections, right? And it stimulates capillary growth amongst the brain tissue as well. So then we get greater supply of oxygen, greater supply of glucose to the brain. Right? Children with ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, about 50% of those children also exhibit motor coordination problems. Not all of them, but about 50% of ADHD also struggle with motor skills. Children with dyslexia and children with autism also struggle with motor skills. So there's a definite link, at least I believe, there's a definite link there. You know, we're just starting to tease it out. It's going to be a major area of research for many years to come. So if we look at our ecological approach to research, all right, so our triangle, dynamical systems, perception, action idea, then we have learned that perception of the environment develops a little ahead of the movement skills. So we've discussed that the child the baby has good enough visual acuity to begin moving, right? They've got good enough visual acuity for things in the environment to be intriguing, and they want to go explore them. And that's part of the motivation for the onset of self-locomotion. Okay. So our movement skills are clearly gained using perceptual information to guide us. If I couldn't see the table, then I can't move around the table, right? But also, new perceptions, new views of the environment are achieved by moving, right? So how do I know there's a corridor outside the classroom? If I'm standing over here, I can't see the corridor, right? The only way I know that there's a corridor is by walking, moving, self-locomoting and go, oh look, there's something outside the door. Okay? So every time we move, we change the perceptual information, particularly the visual information that we're receiving, and that teaches us more about the environment. So they go hand in hand together. Okay? So action facilitates perceptual development. Some perceptions children learn after they start moving. Okay? It's called a perception-action loop. Right? I perceive something, I move to go and explore it, I get there, I explore it, I learn something else about the object. So it's very hard to kind of pull them apart. Page 232, let me see. Ah, yes, good. All right. So this study, 1963, is one of the first that gave us this this really strong link between movement and perceptual development. So what they did was they took newborn kittens and they put them into this sort of merry-go-round setup. So if you look at page 242, there's a diagram of the setup there. All right? So they put them into this sort of merry-go-round. One kitten, bless you. One kitten was put into a little box, and the other kitten was put into a harness. And the merry-go-round was surrounded with a drum. Okay? So one kitten walked round and round and round in circles, and the other kitten got carried round and round and round in circles. Okay? So the interesting thing about this is if you picture that setup, both kittens received the exact same visual stimulation, right? Because they didn't blindfold the kitten that was in the box, so it's just sitting in the box watching as they go round and round, and the other kitten is watching, but it's walking round and round, okay? Well, what they found when they took the kittens out and they tested them was that the kitten that had been carried had inaccurate depth perception. Its blinking reflex didn't match the object that was being moved towards it, right? And more obviously, its motor skills were hindered, were delayed. Right? So the action of walking and looking allowed the moving kitten to develop appropriate depth perception for the age of the kitten. The carrying and looking delayed depth perception for the kitten that didn't walk. Right. So the actual moving made a difference somehow to the brain's interpretation of that visual information that it was receiving. Okay. Then more recently, Campos and his team were over in California. I'm not sure if he's still teaching actually because he was pretty old. They were looking at infants and baby walkers. So what they did, they took infants who were pre-locomotor, who hadn't started to crawl or creep yet, and put them into a baby walker. So crawling's around 7 months, creeping is around 8 months. So they started these children around 6 months, so before they were self-locomoting. Put them in the baby walker, and then they got what is effectively self-locomotion experience because they're moving their feet to move the baby walker on the wheels. Right? Does that make sense? So what they found was that when they tested these infants on that visual cliff setup that we looked at last week, beginning of this week, anyway, the visual cliff that we looked at, what they found was that the response to the height, the drop-off, i.e. depth perception, was related to the experience with moving despite the age of the baby. So if they put a 6-month-old in, and we said with the visual cliff it took 3 to 4 weeks of self-locomotion before they refused to go over the edge, right? So they put a 6-month-old in a baby walker, and at 7 months old, it refused to go over the edge. Right? Whereas if you wait for the child to self-locomote on its own, then it needs 3 to 4 weeks of its own experience before it won't go over the edge to help that depth perception develop. Right? So it's really fascinating. Baby walkers are kind of out of favor. Hopefully they will come back in. It's a bit like playground equipment, right? All the playgrounds got rid of anything that meant children could climb, and now it's all coming back because we realize how important it is. Baby walkers went out of fashion because some children got hurt quite badly because they fell downstairs in the baby walker. My argument is it wasn't the baby walker's fault. It was the adult who was supposed to be watching the baby in the baby walker's fault, right? Baby walkers give these children extra experience of self-locomotion. That encourages cognitive development. So from a motor development perspective, they're a very good tool to use with an infant. Also, they looked at spatial relationships. And so what they found was they used an object permanence task that had some searching. So what they would do is they would have a black curtain and they would play with the toy, with the baby, and then put it behind the black curtain. So based upon the amount of self-locomotion experience, the baby would search for the toy or not search for the toy. Right? So the sequence there would go, they would learn to retrieve, so they would start to dig under the curtain, which means they understand object permanence. The toy didn't go away because it was behind the curtain. They knew it was still there. So that's the first stage. Okay. then the next stages involve moving. So they would start to try to reach around the curtain to get to the toy. Right? Then, after a couple of weeks, they would creep around to get the toy. Right? So the more experience they've got, the more their understanding of how to retrieve something that's been taken away has developed. Right? They're oddly better with something that is solid, opaque, rather than something they can see through, because that seems to confuse them. Somehow there's a conflict there, because they can see it but they can't get at it, and that seems to be more confusing for them. There's some more about the barriers. Ooh, this one. I want to go over this one with you. So this one is more about this barrier idea, which is linked with spatial awareness. All right, that I have to go around something to get what I want. Okay. This one, they were looking at the reaction to a slope. So this involves depth perception again, just a slightly different way of approaching it. All right. So initially, they looked at slopes, and what they found was that a child who was crawling or creeping would go down the slope head first, regardless of how steep the slope was. So it was a little more sensitive way of looking at depth perception than the visual cliff, because they would just go down head first and land on their nose if it was too steep. But by the time they were walking, so they're creeping at around 8 months, they're walking at around 12 months, so about 4 months of experience. When they were walking, they would get to the top of the slope and turn around and go down backwards on their hands and knees. Right? So that 4 months of self-locomotion has allowed their depth perception to develop to the point where they were able to judge that that slope was not a good plan. Right? They also looked at deforming surfaces, so bubble wrap or squishy foam type surfaces, and they found there that the children with more experience would hesitate more to walk on a surface that was kind of not stable. I used to see that a lot in the gym when I taught trampolining, baby trampolining, like the babies who are on their tummies or would just go out on the trampoline. The kids who are just starting to stand up would go, whoa, right? Because it gives as they step on it. All right. So we mentioned affordances quite a way back, but we need to reintroduce affordances. So the affordance is the movement options a particular environment gives to me, that I perceive from a particular environment. So it's very individual because everybody's perception of the environment is slightly different, and it's based on experience. All right? So perception of the affordance is our ecological view versus information processing would say it was a much more direct route, that information was received by the brain made a decision and initiated a movement. Right? So the ecological view is I don't have to cognitively analyze everything that's in the environment to perceive a movement option. I can, that's just automatic, right? Given our own capabilities as an individual. Okay, so remember my example of getting off the plane at Dallas, and there's a staircase, there's a moving escalator, and there's a lift, elevator, right? Which option do, everybody has the same environment, but different people perceive different opportunities to move within that environment. So affordances then incorporate body scale. We mentioned that before with the staircase. Like, I'm not going to go up the staircase 1 foot at a time until such time as my leg, the ratio between my leg length and the stair height is beneficial, right? So growth and development then change my capability and therefore change my perception of the affordance from the environment. So we've got an interaction benefit. The more I interact with a particular environment, the more positively I'm able to perceive the affordance it gives me to move. Right? So if I walk down into the weight room, I started lifting weights when I was 10. No one can tell me I don't know what I'm doing in a weight room. I'm very comfortable there. If I go into a swimming pool, even though I've been swimming since I was little, I haven't done a lot of swimming, I'm much less confident. I'm not going to go and jump in the deep end. I'm going to let myself down into the shallow end because I don't perceive the same opportunity. I'm going to be a little bit careful in a swimming pool versus a gym. Okay? But that's my personal background. Okay? So because it involves body scale, it means that scaling sports equipment, scaling toys, scaling nets, scaling court sizes is very, very important if we want people who are less experienced to perceive an opportunity to use that environment. The USTA, the US Tennis Association, just started a just a couple of years ago, started a new program for 10 and unders, right? And so what they've done is they're providing shorter rackets with bigger heads that don't weigh very much, slightly bigger balls that bounce more. They've changed the size of the court and they've brought the net in. So it's kind of logical. Now these kids can go out and play tennis and really work on good technique. Chrissy Evert, if you know enough about tennis, you know Chrissy Evert is an American tennis player who won many, 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 many tournaments, 3 Wimbledons, 4 US Opens, I think. Really good tennis player. She was probably the first player to use a two-handed backhand. A lot of people now use a two-handed backhand, right? But she says the reason she developed her two-handed backhand is because her dad was a tennis coach, and so he would take her to the tennis court because he couldn't leave her at the house and their mum was at work. And he'd give her a racket so that she'd shut up and let him get on with his teaching. But she got a full-size racket where she couldn't hit the ball. So she started using 2 hands on the racket to hit the ball, and it turned into, at the time, the most killer shot on the circuit, right? it was a thing of beauty. Now it's kind of old-fashioned if you watch a film of her, but at the time, it was amazing, right? So scaling, that's why on the playground I've got paddles and, you know, big balls, small balls, and I try to scale as much as I can given what I can get my hands on out of the play catalogs, which isn't enough yet, but they're getting better at it. All right? So remember that stairs afford climbing related to the rise of the stair and the length of the person's leg. Right? So I'm going to see them do this until the legs are long enough to be able to step up comfortably. All right? Okay. We will do have a look at this. So we'll quickly mention this again because that was from lab and a couple of people aren't in lab. And then we will pick up there on Monday. So let's have a quick look at this. So deprivation has to be pretty severe deprivation to put individuals at risk for typical perceptual development. It does happen occasionally. Every now and then we hear horrific stories about a child that was found locked in an attic and they've been there since they were 4 and now they're 12 or something, right? But it does have to be quite severe to see that effect. Movement experience absolutely impacts synaptic connections in the brain. All right? Remember our windows of opportunity for our motor skills. All right? The more experience I have, the more synapses I make when we're younger. If we can, under 10, give them lots and lots and lots of different movement experiences, they can create many, many more synapses. From the age of 10, we start to prune away synapses that aren't being used. So the problem is we're typically quite active up to puberty, right? After puberty, makeup becomes more interesting, boys become more interesting, how we're dressed becomes more interesting. For boys, the muscles become more, and so we see a drop-off in how enthusiastic we are to move for many people. Not you guys, obviously, right? But for many people, post-puberty, they become less active. Well, the less active I am, the more pruning we're doing, and therefore the more difficult it becomes to become skilled at moving. Right? So I don't do anything as a teenager, or even in my early 20s and 30s, and then I hit 40, and my doctor says, ooh, you know, you really need to be moving around a little bit more and getting some more activity so that you can be healthy, right? But if I can't hit a ball, I can't kick a ball, I can't catch a ball, I don't enjoy dancing, that leaves me walking, possibly riding a bike. Those get pretty boring after a while, right? The way to keep adults active is to give them lots of things to do, right? So today you play tennis, tomorrow you go swimming, the next day you ride your bike, the next day you take the dog for a, right? But if I can't hit a ball, I don't want to play.